the intelligence achievement that turned to be an intelligence disaster, the Jericho Wall, which was a code name for a top secret Israeli operation in May 22, when Israeli intelligence was able to obtain the Hamas detailed war plan, how to initiate the attack, to breach defense in 60 places, and to destroy Israeli defenses and conquer much of the Gaza division that is stretched throughout the border. If you look at the plan and you look at what actually happened, the fence on October 7 was breached in 58 places. So the invasion was an exact materialization of the Jericho Wall, and it was in the hands of the Israelis in May 22.
It's 8 p.m. on Wednesday, June 26th in New York City. It's 3 o'clock a.m. on Thursday, June 27th in Israel. One of the questions we repeatedly get from you, our listeners, when you're making suggestions for episodes, is where was the IDF on October 7th? It's a topic that I have strenuously avoided since, well, I figured there'll be a formal commission of inquiry that attempts to understand all that went wrong and why, and there'll be a time and a place for that. Israel, after all, has a long history of these ruthless commissions of inquiry after wars. And yet, as this war in Gaza winds down, and as Israel prepares for another possible war, the question just keeps reemerging. Where was the IDF on October 7th? What lessons can be learned from the failures, from the breakdowns? More and more Israeli journalists I know are exploring the topic. So we have decided to dedicate an episode from time to time in the weeks ahead to try to understand what these journalists are learning and how the lessons from their reporting could apply to future wars and future security decisions. My only caveat in exploring this topic is it is a difficult topic for all the obvious reasons. And the information is still uneven. There's still an element of fog of war. So to get all the details and all the facts will take a long time. That said, when I was in Israel last week, I visited Dr. Ronen Bergman one evening in his home. We sat, had tea, and a long conversation about what he has been piecing together. Ronen Bergman is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, and he's a senior correspondent for military and intelligence affairs for Yediot Achronot, Israel's largest daily newspaper. Ronen also won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on this war and the pre-war intelligence failures. Ronen is regarded as one of the most well-sourced journalists in Israel when it comes to Israel's intelligence community. He's also published numerous books, including Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations, which was a New York Times bestseller, and also The Secret War with Iran. Ronen is also a member of the Israeli Bar. He clerked in the Attorney General's office, and he has a master's degree in international relations and a PhD in history from Cambridge University in England. Ronen Bergman on Where Was the IDF on October 7th. This is Call Me Back. And I'm pleased to welcome to this podcast for the first time my friend Ronen Bergman. We are here somewhere in Tel Aviv, in the Tel Aviv area. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for the invite. Heard so many very good things about the podcast. Happy to be here in person.
Ronen, the reason I wanted to touch base with you while I was in town, what we spend a lot of time on this podcast doing is usually trying to understand what's happening in the war. We've spent less time trying to figure out how Israel got to October 7th, how October 7th happened. And there's a lot of confusing signals. There's a lot of noise. We try to separate the signal from the noise. There's a lot of agendas, a lot of people who have various equities in trying to explain how Israel got to October 7th.
And a lot of guilt and responsibility that people are happy to share with others.
Right. And as our listeners know, I have been steadfast in trying to push off serious discussions of how Israel got to October 7th, because my view is there's so many political agendas embedded in that, and there's so much finger pointing. And the most important thing is Israel's got to figure out what it's doing, how it's going to fight this war, how it's going to win this war, and there'll be a time for figuring out how October 7th happened. There'll be a commission of inquiry and all these various processes, and I want to let those play out. That said, I think increasingly what I'm finding in discussions I have with Israelis is understanding how Israel got to October 7th is not only important for purposes of responsibility and understanding what went wrong, it also informs what Israel does in this war. Understanding what it got wrong should inform what Israel does now in this war, how Israel defines success ultimately, how Israel deals with other threats in the region, how Israel can have confidence in its intelligence capabilities. So there are a lot of real-time issues that we're dealing with, which is why I wanted to get into some of this with you. And by my lights, there are two parts to this question. The first part is the decade plus long policy that was government policy that was undergirded by a series of assumptions about Gaza and Hamas and the threat that it seems like Israel got wrong. And then there's operationally, at a very practical level, what happened on October 7th. The failure for Israel, A, to maintain security at the border, and B, to respond to the situation more rapidly than it did. But before that, you've been covering Israel's intelligence services for decades. How would you compare the role that intelligence and the intelligence community plays in Israel compared with other countries?
On the 2nd of June, 1948, in the midst of this horrible war of independence, 2 weeks after Israel was established, 2 weeks after the IDF was established, the situation was dire. David Ben-Gurion found the time to get some people secretly to his new office in a shat in Kiryat in Tel Aviv and established the Israeli intelligence community. He was like a prophet. He realized he was one of the only who truly believed that Israel will win that war. The CIA thought that the Arabs will slaughter the Jews in 2 weeks. He said we will win. But he also realized that the IDF, that is mostly reservist, cannot be stationed on the border of Israel throughout the year because there will be no state, no prosperity, no economy. And that this needs to be bartered, replaced with intelligence, top intelligence from inside enemy ranks that would bring a sufficient alert in order to recruit the reservists and what the enemy is planning, what are his weapon and his tactics, and later what the terrorist organization are doing. The intelligence is taking, I think, the most decisive and critical role in the history of Israel, more than any other country, at least in the Western world. Dictatorship are different because it's part of preserving the regime. But in Israel, there is no historical important decision-making, no historical turn, nothing important that happened without the significant imprint of the intelligence. Not all of it was good. Sometimes the Israeli James Bond looks more like Inspector Clouseau, but it was always there and very, very important. And also always the overarching thought of necessity. I once had a conversation with someone who was holding the Iranian file, the Iranian operations of the CIA. We thought, what is like the difference between CIA and Israeli intelligence in general? It's that additional thought with which the employees of Israeli intelligence are going to work every morning. Like everybody, they want to feel happy, they want to fulfill themselves, they want to earn some money, but they have an additional thought, this is necessity. And if an operation, CIA operation in Malaysia goes wrong, it's bad, but in most cases, I know September 11 is exception, in most cases it would not affect US citizens. Here, I once met in the cyber lab of Shin Bet, person that left Motorola with second degree from the Technion, leaving Motorola, her salary was cut into half the day she went to work for Shin Bet. And I asked her, I said, why? You leave a good job with the prosperity, with the prospect of a lot of money for this, with many shifts, you don't see your family now. She said, yes, and I'm very happy. I said, why? She said, first of all, it's only action here. And I'm one of the first of the few that see this. Second, if I invent something that works, it will be implemented immediately. In Motorola, maybe not. And third, the flip side of the first one, the dark side of that coin, is that if I don't perform well, then tomorrow someone might get killed. Maybe even someone I know. Maybe even my family. The necessity. It was always there, but something went really wrong in the days and month and years before October 7th. It's not about bad intention. It's not about nonchalant or some kind of apathy towards that, but it's not about a certain person that needed to, put the needle somewhere else. It's a total collapse of the intelligence community and the military of Israel.
Complacency, self-confidence, over self-confidence?
Vanity. It's the thought that those are just a bunch of some Gazans. Maybe Iran, they are considered to be sophisticated, or Hezbollah. They were seen as the main threat. But those Gazans, what can they do? And this is the price of vanity. Israeli intelligence believed in something they called intelligence supremacy. And again, it's unbelievable the similarities between things that happened in the Yom Kippur War and were never researched and understood, and what happened on October 7. On April 1973, the head of Israeli military intelligence, Major General Eli Zeira, promised the cabinet that he is able to give them 24 to 48 hours alert before an Egyptian attack. Why was he able? Because he had something he called the policy, the insurance policy. The insurance policy were, in that time, sophisticated devices attached to main encrypted communication line of the Egyptian military. And it was, the Israelis were certain that if an attack is coming, then they will speak over those lines, and the Israelis were able to hear. But they didn't. A year before, they captured a telephone pole by one of the main highways that hidden, it looked like a regular one, but a hidden a bugging device intercepting their communication. So they realized, even if they didn't find the others, they realized the capabilities. In 2018, Hamas suspected a group of NGO health workers, Arabs, but something in their story didn't fit. And it turned out that they are undercover, top secret platoon of Israeli intelligence. And they had to run away, firing their way out. And one Israeli fighter was killed in the fire, and some others were wounded. But they left behind, and all the others were able to flee under heavy fire, massive fire from the IDF that came to help. But they left behind a lot of equipment. And the IDF tried to bomb the equipment, but did not destroy enough. And soon after, Hamas was deducting the obvious. What they were doing, they were trying to hook into a Hamas encrypted communication. And so the belief in Israel was of intelligence supremacy, like what Eli Zeira told the cabinet in April 1973. That if Hamas is planning something, they will do that over channels that Israel censors monitor. And if the censors do not monitor, it means that they will not attack. Guess what? They either used, this is yet to be investigated, but they either used the channel for deception, meaning feeding the channel with false information, or they just didn't speak. Remember, I said that
they did it all analog.
They had people meeting among themselves.
Maybe just set the table by explaining to me what were the basic assumptions embedded in the Israeli security establishment and the Israeli political establishment's approach to Hamas, Gaza, the threat from Hamas, in the years, the decade plus before October 7th.
This is one of course, the main questions. And in the intelligence world, this will be the question of intentions. What is the mindset? What are the plans? What are the intentions of the enemy? Or in this case, the enemy can be concise to the gap between the right and the left year of Yahya Sinwar. Because since 2015, 16, Yahya Sinwar is almost the only important voice in Hamas. And this is in spite of some of his rivals there trying to diminish his power. But it was clear to Israel that it's all about Sinwar.
And that's beginning when? When did they know it's all about Sinwar? Soon after his release from prison?
No, but soon after his release from prison, he and another person named Mushta, that is one of his closest associates, that was released with him from prison at the Shalit deal, they were starting an offense inside Hamas in order to gain more and more power. And then came defensive edge of 2014.
So just for our listeners, so that's the 2014 Gaza, Hamas-Israel war, lasted about 50 days. Yeah. It was the last major IDF operation in Gaza before the war of October 7th.
And Sinwar was not the leader of Hamas in Gaza, it was Haniya.
During a protective edge.
Yes. And then the military commander of Hamas that did not perform as they expected, Mohammed Def, he sent an apology to Qasem Soleimani, the head of Quds Force.
In Iran.
And said, it's not us, the Qassam Brigade, the military wing of Hamas, that are to be blamed. It's the politicians.
So they believe they failed with protective edge in 2014. And Mohammed Def had what role at the time?
The same role, the military commander of Hamas.
He was the military commander of
Hamas. The
Hamas.
head of Qassam Brigade.
And he sends a message to Soleimani in Iran saying, we failed, but it's not our fault. It was the political decision maker.
Yeah.
Which is Haniya.
Now, of course, he apologized because the Iranians were supplying them with massive aid in all fields and military buildup. So he said, this is why we didn't perform. And we didn't perform, he said, because they did not allow us, the politicians, to attack first, to come in an imminent surprise, strategic attack against Israel.
Just for our listeners, Mohammed Def and Yahya Sinwar are to this day close associates, basically co-heads of Hamas, effectively.
So in spite of 2 years after, Sinwar elected to be the political leader of Hamas in Gaza, he remained part of the military infrastructure and very close to the leaders of the military leader. And basically, and now we know this from protocols and notes from meetings that were taking place before October 7 and were now captured in Gaza, Hamas records, that he was the military commander and the political leader. He was leading everything. And those two conclusions, that Hamas needs to attack in a total surprise and Hamas needs to disregard the politicians, were totally implemented on October 7. But all of that was happening outside the eyesight of Israeli intelligence. And let me just jump to the end, which is the clearest point, I think, that gives an understanding to this blindness. And this is in a meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister of all the leaders of the intelligence and the military, and on October 2nd, it's a Monday, and they have a unanimous reading of Hamas. The Prime Minister, the National Security Advisor, and all the leaders of Israeli intelligence.
This is what date?
October 2nd, 5 days before the war. And they all, with no dispute, with no one standing and saying, well, maybe it's different, they all say, Hamas is deterred, weakened. In Hebrew, it sounds better. It's sholet, mukhlash, murta. And after that, this was a secret meeting, of course, but the National Security Advisor of Israel, Tzachi Hanegbi, went on radio that day and gave publicity to this assessment. He said, Hamas are deterred and will be deterred for many years after the previous war, the previous round, which is in May 21. So the conception, as they call it today in Israel.
The conceptia.
The conceptia, which is a derogatory term that was borrowed from the investigation of the Yom Kippur War. Right. Now, to have a conception is not a bad thing. What is bad is not to see that it changed. The conception was Israel has been facing more or less one kind of enemy in the last 3 decades. They call themselves Jabha al-Mukawama, the resistant front. Israel calls them the jihadist front or the radical front. So Iran, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and all the other militias that they support. By nature, they are jihadist. But one of the main pillars of Israeli defense strategy was that all the component of that front, even if they are calling for suicide bombers, even if they are nonchalant to the death of thousands, even from their own people, they are not suicidal themselves. This was the belief. Once they get an organization or a territory or a country they rule, they will not risk the destruction of that area and therefore the destruction of the achievement they already have in an all-out war with Israel.
And this is at what level of the organization of Hamas? That the theory of the Israeli security intelligence establishment was, at what level is that view that they're practical? They're survivalist and they're practical and they're not messianic. They actually want to build, hang on to territory, quote unquote, govern, preserve. They're not reckless and suicidal. So that's up and down the organization?
Up and down, of course, but this is a totalitarian organization, totalitarian rule of a small country, the Gaza Strip. But still, after, according to this reading, after doing so much and seizing control in 2007 of a small country, but still like a state that they control, they wouldn't risk an Israeli invasion, an all-out war with a mighty enemy and losing everything they achieved. And there was a belief now, if you look at what is happening now in Lebanon, though Nasrallah, Hezbollah are fighting Israel, but they are also keeping the threshold of not going to an all-out war. So this theory in Iran also kept some kind of boundaries. So this theory works, but sometimes, as it turned out in October 7, it doesn't. And while Israel felt that it is able to find some kind of solution, some kind of settlement, some kind of ways to stabilize the horrible relations with the Gazans and Hamas, the Hamas was planning something else. Now, if you want to have a more colorful way to describe it, on October 1st, 2018, 5 years before the war, Sinwar gave an interview to Yediot Ahronot. It was Francesca, an Italian reporter.
Right, it was a joint interview for Yediot Ahronot and La Republic in Italy.
He knew that this is for Yediot, so by itself, this was a step. And then you read the text. He's speaking about, he says, we don't need more wars. I am keen to have all Gazans and Gazan children go to swim in the beach. There are Palestinian children in Gaza that never went to the beach. It's not normal. You hear a much moderate than you expect. Now, here's the question. Was he lying in that interview and was planning this all along? Or he changed through time because whatever happened, the Saudi deal that he wanted to disrupt, or he wanted to free the prisoners and couldn't do that with. This is one of the main questions that is deeply occupying Israeli intelligence now.
But in that interview, in that article, did Israeli intelligence believe at the time, he's thinking more practically. He's thinking more like a leader, like a mayor who's responsible for running a town or a city than he is a jihadist?
Some did, and it looked reasonable. Also, it coincided with the policy initiated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was asking Qatar to help fund the Gazan government, which is, as we know, is controlled by Hamas. And in many occasions, he spoke about Hamas. He says Hamas is an asset. Like Netanyahu, some political analysts believe because he didn't want to have the Palestinian Authority as a one representative for the Palestinian people, he thought that having those two divide and rule would be better. This policy, bringing the money from Qatar, was defended and pushed and trusted by most parts of Israeli intelligence because they believed what Sinwar said.
This policy meaning of getting funds to impoverished Palestinians, to those Palestinians in Gaza who were impoverished, they needed to get funding to them, and Qatar was a vehicle through which to do it.
Yeah, but of course, even if Hamas was not stealing the money, which soon they found it is doing at least partly, money is fungible. When Hamas doesn't need to pay those $100 a month to a teacher, and Qatar is doing that, then Hamas can take the $100. But what is interesting is that the Qatari funding was not secret. Everybody saw it. And when Prime Minister Bennett came to be the prime minister, he wanted to cut that. The military and the intelligence, parts of the intelligence didn't want, because they were fearing escalation, because it was clear that now the strip is sort of addicted to the money. And if you cut that, you will end up with riots that Hamas will, of course, inflate. And so they had some kind of a compromise, and they stopped the cash, but they continued to send the money over. In retrospect, I think that there's no one that does not regret. And Yossi Cohen, the chief of Mossad, before he left office, he who was mediating the connection with Qatar, he said it's getting out of control and we should stop. And his successor, Dadi Barnea, in the meetings with the new elected government, so the Bennett government, and then the Lapid government, and then the Netanyahu government, he objected, but he was overruled. And as late as Yom Kippur, 28th of September, he meets in Qatar with the ambassador for Gaza, El Amadi, and he gives him the okay, which he objected, but of course, a civil servant, he takes the Israeli policy and the orders he got from Netanyahu, from Prime Minister Netanyahu. He said, we are continuing. They need to renew this after, periodically. And one of the assumptions, yet to be fully proved, but already in the intelligence collected from Gaza, there are more than just hints, that Sinwar was playing on that card. He was making sure that Israel will be fed all the time with good signs, hope, some ceasefire. Now, the Qataris, who were also misled, they gave Israel the same signs. And more than that, the political bureau of Hamas that is based in Qatar, they were convinced that this is going this way, because Sinwar realized that if he wants to make this a total surprise, that the condition for the success of this operation is a total surprise, that if he wants to have total surprise, he needs to keep the secret among few associates in Gaza and not communicate that in any way to anyone else, because Israel, maybe it's ironic or absurd, Israel has a much better intelligence on faraway enemies than on Hamas. If they would be updating Nasrallah or Iran, there's a strong chance that Israel would know. But he kept that. And also, he knew that the political bureau will stop him, because there was a clash, and Israel understood there was a clash of what is Hamas? Hamas, is it a governing organization or is it a jihadist? And he decided what is the outcome of this debate or dispute between him and the politicians. He just forgot to send them the email that he decided, and he just decided for them. Now, so this is about intentions. Well, everything I said now, everything we discussed is about the intention, the total misreading of Sinwar's intentions, whether he was telling the truth on that interview and changed through time.
Or whether it was a fake. It was a fake. But that only tells you whether or not he'd been going back for, say, a decade, or he had been planning this since sometime after 2018.
But you can explain a mistake in reading someone's mind. You don't have the bugging device to attach to his mind.
Not yet, yeah.
And if you keep a secret among 5 or 6 people, then, you can understand why this was not picked up. But then there's the second biggest failure, which is the total misunderstanding, misreading of Hamas capabilities. And this is where the intelligence achievement that turned to be an intelligence disaster, the Jericho wall, which was a code name for a top secret Israeli operation in May 22, when Israeli intelligence was able to obtain the Hamas war plan, the detailed war plan, how to initiate the attack, to breach defense in 60 places, and to destroy Israeli defenses and conquer much of the Gaza division that is stretched throughout the border. If you look at the plan and you look at what actually happened, the fence on October 7 was breached in 58 places. So the invasion was an exact materialization of the Jericho wall, and it was in the hands of the Israelis in May 22. Now, so what happened? What happened was that Israel considered Jericho wall, they called it a compass for the building of force. So not an attacking plan for something they can do, but a plan for something they want to do one day.
It was aspirational, but it wasn't, by the analysis of the Israeli leadership, it wasn't an operational plan to be implemented anytime in the near future.
So while the plan is about to breach the fence in 60 places with 24 Nukhba platoons spread all over and more forces from other parts of Hamas, Israel believed that they can breach the fence maximum in 2 places with maybe 70 Nukhba terrorists. So 3,000 people in 60 places in the plan, and Israel says maximum 2 with 70 people. It's not the same universe.
Right.
And why did Israel believe that Hamas cannot execute Jericho? This is one of the key questions. Generally, it's again a great Israeli achievement turned into a disaster. After 2014, the defensive edge war, the Israeli intelligence and military realized that there is a problem. The problem is Hamas is planning a massive attack using tunnels going from Gaza into Israel. During 2014, the extent, the depth of the problem became clear because suddenly some terrorists popped up by Sderot and killed soldiers. And thanks to some Israeli troops, they were stopped. But it was clear that intelligence would not be enough to supply a full information about all the tunnels. That there needs to be some other solution. And then when seeing the cross-border tunnels as the main threat, the Israeli defense establishment recruited itself and they came with a solution. The solution was a subterranean fence going, they call the Salaric fence, with sensors, with massive concrete, enforced concrete, going from the ground until minus 70 meters. And that was concluded in 2020. And soon after, the Israeli intelligence...
Covering the entire
border, hemisphere of the border. Massive operation.
Now, Hamas must have known Israel was doing this. They could see it. They could see the construction.
And soon after, Israel realized, Israeli intelligence learned, that Hamas just realized that they cannot cross it, that it's not breachable. So from the Israeli point of view, they were too enchanted by this achievement. They said, okay, Hamas was planning an invasion. The invasion was planned to be with tunnels dug into the territory of Israel. Now they cannot do that. So the only thing they can do, one is to try and invade Israel above ground. But then, of course, Israel will see them. And the fence had 7 different mechanisms of detection and kill. Automatic guns and scouts and computers and robots and all sorts of... So if they come above ground, Israel will stop them. So they cannot. They can only send 2 platoons of 70 people in 2 places. That's it. And they call it in Hebrew, pshita, which means a raid. The danger, the risk was defined as pshita, as raid, and not plisha, invasion. And even this small euphemism, the small unit in the Gaza brigade, the Gaza division, in the intelligence cell that was supposed to track Hamas plans for an invasion, was called raid cell,
meaning the outfit within Israeli intelligence that was assigned to monitor this possible operation. The cell was, the nomenclature was referring to it as a raid rather than an invasion.
Because nobody thought that an invasion can happen.
And this comes back to your point about the mindset. The mindset was invasion can happen, and then they probably didn't want it to happen.
They didn't want. And so maybe they have plans on the paper of some kind of a desired, so Jericho, or desired capability one day, but they don't want and they cannot. And if they try, the fence will stop them. You know, on the second day of the Yom Kippur War, Moshe Dayan, the Israeli Minister of Defense, at noon came to see Golda Meir. The disaster was not yet fully known, but it was clear that it's not going the way that Israel wanted. And he said, Mrs. Prime Minister, I was wrong. I thought that the Egyptians don't have a chance to cross the Suez Canal. There are papers of Israeli intelligence written before this current war that are using the same language of intelligence documents that were written before October 73. It's like some kind of a devilish, hideous angel came and make those people write the same words. 10 minutes past 3 o'clock a.m. in the night between 6 and 7, the Shin Bet, so the Israeli Domestic Secret Service, is sending a telegram to some of the units of the military in the Shin Bet. It says, we have some worrying or concerning signs that Hamas is going to emergency status, meaning attack, but it is our assessment that Sinwar does not want escalation. If you look at what the intelligence produced on the morning of the 7th, it's exactly the same language. And so what Israel didn't do was to seek and check whether Hamas was able to close the gap and reach the capability to execute Jericho wall. There were some people on a lower level of the intelligence who said, we are monitoring this exercise, this drill. We see that they're improving. We see that they're closing the gap. But at the end, there was no one to challenge no one like a serious alert with intelligence that challenged both the assessment on the intentions of Sinwar and the assessment on the capabilities of Hamas.
Can we just stay on the capabilities? Because there's two aspects to the tunnel system. There's the tunnel system, the part of the tunnel system that's able to penetrate Israel. And then there's the tunnel system that we've learned all too much about since October 7th, which is this 350 miles underground in Gaza, this labyrinth where Hamas can command a war from, can hide hostages in, store weapons in. How aware was Israel of the depth and breadth of this tunnel system before October 7th? Not the part that penetrates Israel, but just the city of tunnels inside Gaza.
So I think looking at this reflects the quantity and quality of intelligence in general that Israel had about Hamas. I once wrote that the unsuccessful attempt to understand where is Gilad Shalit should have been used by Israel as a sign of warning. Now, Gilad Shalit, a live soldier, was kept in Gaza for 5.5 years. During that time, Israel didn't know where he is, and the extent of non-successful attempts, not even to rescue him, but even know where he is, was so deep that they felt they were sure that he's not in Gaza anymore, because if he was in Gaza, they would pick up something, because someone alive creates noise. You need to feed him, to guard him, to change his bed sheets, etc. Even when he was back to Israel and debriefed about everything he remembered, even now they don't know where he was kept for most of the time. This is just one small example. Gaza is near Israel. Israel has been monitoring that with all the different sensors, human and SIGINT.
But you can't build all that infrastructure without military equipment and cement and supplies and experts and construction workers and engineers. And like I said, it's like building a subway system.
Yeah. So at a certain point, when Israel realized that the crossing tunnels are no longer a problem, they were still very much worrying about the tunnels from Egypt, but this is not something Israel could do something militarily against. It could try to negotiate with Egypt with small success. But all the rest seemed to the Israeli leadership, political and military and intelligence, as not very important. Because if they want to continue dig tunnels because, I don't know, they are bored or they just want to continue, what's the meaning of that? And nobody thought that maybe the explanation is not just because they are bored, or because they work under orders, or they need to be busy, but because those are not attacking, not offensive tunnels, but defensive tunnels, to maintain redundancy of Hamas in case of Israeli invasion. Now, if Hamas knows Israel, understands Israel as much as they say, then the conclusion of that would be that Hamas understands, that Sinwar understands, that Israel would invade Gaza only in a very, very, very extreme case. that Hamas does something very, very bad to Israel. The almost obvious example or conclusion would be that they are preparing for that moment.
So they knew these tunnels were being built. They just didn't make military sense to Israel in terms of them being used in an offensive way.
Yeah, they didn't know enough. In fact, when Israel entered the Gaza Strip, a story my colleague at the time, Patrick Kingsley, and myself published, when Israel entered the Gaza Strip, you made the calculation 2 miles. They thought the assessment was that there was 150 kilometers of tunnels. It turned out that there are at least 750. So the extent of the mistake, there are 157 kilometers just under Khan Yunis, this small outskirt of refugee camps. And when you see what the IDF has said, not just publicly for PR, but among the IDF, among the leaders among the chief of staff, about the results of the bombing of the tunnels in the last war with Hamas in Guardians of the Wall in May 21. One of the leaders of Israeli defense establishment said as late as January 23, Sinwar doesn't want to attack Israel, not because there's a stick or carrot, no carrot, but he knows, Sinwar, after what we did to him in Guardians of the Wall in May 21, that he will not have the subterranean network in the next war. Now, I'm sure that person did not say that just because he invented that or he reflected some wishful thinking. This was based on a realm of reports of Israeli intelligence after that war. Now, it's still, time will tell us, and hopefully more documents, if Israel was just poor with the collection of intelligence or someone in the military lied or make the reports better than they were. But it's clear that Sinwar, from the same bombing, the same operation, the same raid, deducted the opposite conclusions. That the tunnels sustained. They made some clear and fast deduction of conclusions. They added more zigzags to the tunnels, more blast doors. And what Israel discovered was not just longer, but vast and stronger and bigger and smarter than anything. They didn't know that there was a Chinese machine that can build a tunnel as wide as a truck. I visited that tunnel. They found a video of Ahmed Sinwar, the brother of who was running the whole campaign of the tunnels, the whole project, in his private car, going through the tunnel. And there's so much more. And because Israel thought this is not a problem, they did not prepare the necessary gear and methods. And it turned out to be even when you discover a tunnel, even when you declare it free from booby traps, it just turned out to be very, very difficult to destroy them. You need to use special means, and it's very slow. And the IDF prediction now that even if Israel controls the Gaza Strip, it could take like up to 3 years to destroy everything.
You published an op-ed the day before October 7th, on the 50th anniversary of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Retired Major General Aharon Farkas, former head of military intelligence, also published a piece, both pieces in Yediot Achronot, about lessons learned, legacy of.
Lessons not learned.
Lessons not learned from the Yom Kippur War and their relevance for today. This was published the day before October 7th. What were those lessons, learned or not learned? And to what extent did they rear their head, their ugly head, 24 hours after these pieces were published?
So both of us ended our stories, our op-eds, with a warning that Israel is exposed to another strategic surprise attack by one or more than one of its enemies. When 24 hours later, Hamas attacked, people called me and called Major General Farkas and said, how did you know? How did you predict? You were the only ones. Now, with respect to the credit, we didn't know anything. Nobody knew. What we did know is that the lessons from the Yom Kippur War, this war was not investigated right. One day we'll tell the story of the cover-up of the investigation.
Of the Yom Kippur War?
Of the Yom Kippur War.
But there was the Commission of Inquiry.
there was no investigation into the intelligence blunder, which is the main component there, as now. The investigation panel, headed by former Chief Justice Agranat, they came to the conclusion that few people made the very wrong decisions, that the head of military intelligence, head of the assessment for military intelligence, that they had to make other decisions. And therefore, part of the responsibility lies on their shoulders. But what they did not investigate, they did something that many journalists are doing, and are doing it about October 7 as well. Personification of history. He is to be blamed if that person on that minute would do something different. If you would be able to get into the time machine and go back and force his hand to do this or that, then it's all going to be okay. That prevented a real investigation of the war. Not the fact that they made the wrong call, that's clear. But what led those high-rank, smart, and patriotic, of course, they didn't want Israel to be attacked. What made them was a very, I think, the most sophisticated deception plan in the history of intelligence, maybe until October 7, led by President Sadat. Because the sin of vanity, because Israelis, the defense establishment, their ego, their military, the political, they didn't believe that Sadat and Egypt can perform. There was an investigation in 1974 in Mossad asking the question of whether this was a deception, smart deception. And they came to the surprising conclusion that the Mossad did not follow any deception. Why? Because the Egyptians are not capable of executing deception. So I explain why I was not bluffed, because I say that the other side cannot bluff me. It's like it's a logic circle that collapsed into itself.
Right.
And because this was never investigated. Never. And one day we will publish how the whole thing was covered up. But the interim conclusion of both Major General Farkash, one of the most experienced intelligence officers in Israel, and myself, that the sin of vanity, because Israel did not investigate and deduct the real reason and made the real conclusion, it's almost doomed to fall again into the same pit. And 24 hours later, it happened. So we spoke about intentions, we spoke about capabilities, which sort of mixed together when they were supposed to be totally separate. And the third part of the failure is a total misunderstanding of the decision and the steps to execute October 7th, the specific day. But of course, the specific day was planned long ago, and there was a road taken. Of course, we did speak in the last night.
When do you think they settled on, we're definitely going to do this, and this is the approximate date we'll do it? Based on your sources.
There were ideas of Sinwar to execute that much before.
There were ideas of Sinwar to execute the plan.
The plan.
Earlier.
Much earlier. Mm-hmm. And they were delayed from different reasons. It's clear that they went to do that on a holiday and on Shabbat. Do you recall another surprise that started on Shabbat in a holiday?
Right. For our listeners, that's the Yom Kippur War, the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
Yom Kippur War. And because they knew that the shifts are reducted, the shift in the military, that people are going, that the whole week is a week of vacation, there is still secret teams in the military reading documents. They captured something like 2.5 million pages. It will take some time to read. But what I understand is that there were a few dates, and then in the last month, there was fixation on October 7, and there were many steps that were taken, and none of them was interpreted right. But the unbelievable thing happened. There were like maybe 10,000 Hamas members that were involved in the preparation that night. 10,000. So 10,000 people are taken from their homes in the middle of the night. Most of them are being told that this is a drill. They are being told just much later that it's not.
But 10,000 people plucked away from their homes means that multiply that by 5 or 7 people per person. You've
they
got
see that the guy is gone.
so that's like 60 to 70,000 people know something's going on.
Yeah. There is even an intercept. Shin Bet had an intercept of someone from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad calling his buddy from Hamas and said, what the hell is going on? Why is everybody? He said, no, it's just a drill. And maybe he believed in that. But we also know now that there was a lot of intelligence. And again, I don't want to be seen as, the wisdom of retrospect. It always happens in intelligence blunders that you take all the material, all the intelligence, and you found this group of Middle Eastern training for flights in that place that was
Trust
missed.
me, I worked in the Bush administration, and I mean, at least as far as Iraq is concerned, which is the part I worked on, in retrospect, you have all this data and you have all these memos that if they were all examined and believed to be 100% accurate in the moment, they would have told you a lot. But of course, that's not the way intelligence analysis and collection and evaluation works.
And there's also something in the Israeli intelligence called an alert model, which basically trying to put this crucial need to get alert in some kind of perimeter, some kind of a framework, which basically says, here are signs that something might be happening. Preparation of hospitals, someone of Hamas going underground, some vehicles moving from here to there. And for this reason or the other, and I think the main reason was vanity, was because nobody thought that it could happen. There was no such model vis-a-vis Hamas. There was a model with Hezbollah, but there was no model with Hamas. So even when some signs were picked on that night, even when they saw that there is a Hamas commander going underground, even when some communication that is reserved for emergency network for Hamas started operating, they still saw this as yet another exercise. Because in an exercise, they also operated the same thing. Let me tell you a story. Israeli intelligence believed for the first weeks that the recruitment of the Nukhba through the night was done by foot from door to door. The commanders knocked on the door, said, wake up, take your gear and come. We have an exercise, a night exercise. But when Israeli intelligence briefed the CIA about UNRWA employees that were involved in the attack on October 7th, and the CIA came to meet with the current head of military intelligence, Major General Aaron Khalifa. They asked and they were given with some of the facts, of the proofs. And one day I met with the source and he gave me that briefing that was given to the CIA. And I'm reading it. And in that, I'm reading that one of the UNRWA teachers, who was also a Hamas militant, a Nukhba member, he's getting an SMS at 11 p.m.
Nukhba is the elite military.
It's the front raiding force of Hamas. Those 3,000 that are ranged in 24 platoons. So he's getting an SMS saying, you come to the place where it's agreed to come before the raid, and don't forget to bring the RPG that you kept in your house. I read this, and I look at the source. He says, why are you looking at me? I said, you know why I'm looking at you. And then, of course, we are on audio, so people cannot see. It is, he does this sort of, emoji.
Yeah. Hands up, yeah.
What can I do?
Right.
Because I was looking at him, because apparently at least some of the Nukhba got their alerts through text messages. Not just from people knocking. It's very hard to intercept people knocking at doors. But in any case, 10,000 people are involved. At least 100,000 know that their relative is out of the house. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of movement. And Israel almost doesn't know anything. And the little signs that were picked up are either interpreted as another drill, so imitating war, but not war. And the most was to say, well, maybe there's going to be a raid. A Nukhba breach of the fence in 2 places, 70 people. Okay, it's horrible if they succeed. And so,
but we can handle it.
We can handle it, but it's not. Israel didn't have a real war plan in case of invasion. David Ben-Gurion, who appointed himself as the first Israeli, not just prime minister, but also minister of defense, he created the Israeli defense strategy or Israeli military strategy. it is based on 3 pillars. It sounds much better in Hebrew, I'll translate. Harta'a, hatra'a, achra'a, which means deterrence, alert, and total swift victory. The whole of what Israel was about was getting the intelligence. If the deterrent didn't work and the enemy is about to launch an attack, to get the intelligence, and whatever happens, an immediate shift of the battlefield to enemy territory. And so the Gaza border was not prepared for, nobody thought this is happening. This could be happening. You know, when I was sitting here and I saw the first social media clips that Hamas was sending from inside Israel, it was like 8:30 in the morning, I think, so 2 hours after. And when I first saw it, I thought this is I told the person who said, this is just a fabrication. It's not true. Because nobody could believe. And this third part, the disbelief in the capability and the almost zero knowing of what is happening, that also led to very poor preparations of the IDF that was enchanted by this wall, this fence that was supposed to stop everything. There were high-rank officials, high-rank officers in the Southern Command who said, nothing can cross the fence. It's invincible.
If Israel's theory of the case, if Israel's theory of Hamas had not been their practical, their survivalist, they are not willing to risk it all. They're not willing, they're not messianic, they're into preservation of their lives. They're not jihadist. If the theory had not been that, if their theory had been, no, they're jihadist, that mindset is pervasive up and down the ranks. It is what we know it is today. The quotes you saw from Sinwar recently saying he's willing to sacrifice enormous Palestinian bloodshed to advance their goals. If Israel had known all that,
then the reasonable conclusion would be that Israel cannot wait. Of course, a reasonable conclusion would be that someday Hamas can surprise Israel. If someone would change the whole strategy and believe that Hamas might actually do that, meaning their intention is to continue with jihad, even with performing a suicide attack against themselves, even with risking their own rule, their own lives, but the achievement of getting control over this land, then of course Israel could not have waited. To believe that Hamas is deterred was the very comfortable conclusion for all the different actors in Israel. It was comfortable for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who could say, well, why should I negotiate with the Palestinian Authority? That's not the only representative of the Palestinian people. And of course, nobody asked him to negotiate with Hamas. But it was also comfortable for the military and the intelligence, because another conclusion would force them to act. And this is not easy. Like, in retrospect, of course, everybody are wise. But let's take Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been stockpiling hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles. Israel know about that. So the conclusion is what? To launch war, even if it's not necessary, like if it's not forced on Israel? And there was one person, then the Minister of Defense, Victor Lieberman, who wrote in 2016, wrote a detailed top secret memo with a very precise prediction of what will happen. And he demanded to switch the priorities and put Gaza first and Lebanon second and invade Gaza and destroy Hamas. Preemptively.
Because he had been concerned that there was a version of what we now know to be October 7th in the governing the mindset of Hamas.
He demanded to do that before they get too strong. And when you look at this document for 2016, which now we have, he's like a prophet. And I asked him with another colleague, Mark Mazzetti from the DC Bureau of the New York Times, we went to see him in one of the enterprises that we wrote last year. And I said, how come you were different? Because, he saw something that nobody else. So he banged on the table and says, Russian conspiracy. I understand what conspiracy is. And he laughed a bit. But this was, of course...
This is for our listeners. He's the leader, Avigdor Lieberman is the leader of a political party in Israel that has its roots Russian immigrants.
He was born in Moldova, and he's very popular with the Russian immigrants. Now, it was, of course, none of this conversation was laughable because he was right, apparently. Nobody listened. And he even resigned from his post as a Minister of Defense 2 years after 2 years of attempts to convince the military and the Prime Minister to change their priority and go first against Hamas and only then against Hezbollah. So there was one voice, but if he was winning and Israel would invade Gaza or preemptively strike Hamas and start a war, there would be a massive opposition that would say that this is all about this crazy Russian immigrants that is fed by conspiracies, and he's a warmonger and forced a war that Israel didn't need and didn't want and would not be forced to go through. This is very hard. And of course, this will call for a total change of Israeli mindset and Israeli defense strategy, not just against Hamas, but against everybody.
There's a tendency to have a very binary view. It was a series of bad decisions by the political leadership, by the government. That's one perspective. And then the government and the political leaders point their fingers at bad intelligence and bad intelligence analysis and not necessarily sharing all the relevant information with the political decision makers that would have been necessary to change the policy. I think what you're saying is it's all of the above.
It's all of the above. There's something else which I didn't mention here, but this is the 5 letters of warnings from the intelligence community to Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying that the defragmentation of Israeli society following the so-called judicial overhaul, the weakening the military, but much worse, it's seen by the front of the axis of resistance, the Jabhat al-Muqawama, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, as an opportunity to attack Israel because it is weak. And if that continues, one of the members of the resistant front, of the radical front, might go and grasp the opportunity. And Netanyahu refused to listen. He even refused to meet the chief of staff. He accused the chief of staff in some kind of a conspiracy against him. Of course, the media, the chief of staff, and the front that he usually sees as foes. And it all materialized, those warnings.
And to what extent was the momentum behind normalization with Saudi Arabia a catalyst for, in other words, I try to understand the sequencing, because we knew in fall of 23 that the Saudi-Israeli normalization was moving along at a pretty fast clip, faster, I think, than many people realized, certainly many in the press in the West realized. Did the Hamas know it was moving quickly and they wanted to upend it? Did they make this decision before Saudi normalization was getting momentum? And then how did Saudi normalization fit into their, to the extent that Israeli, your sources now know?
Well, still needs to be much thoroughly investigated from the documents, from the interrogations with some of the Hamas members that were either captured on October 7 or then captured in Gaza, those who were not killed. But there is some intelligence suggesting, first of all, not even intelligence, in the interview that the Hamas leadership in Doha and in Istanbul gave to my colleagues at the New York Times, Ben Hubbard and Maria Ben Habib, they said that. They said that the Saudi deal, their interpretation of the Saudi deal, plus other steps of the Israeli government, the current government, was that soon, if the Saudi deal is executed, then the Palestinian issue will be off the world agenda forever. And they said in that interview, which is, by the way, an amazing interview, because Ben is asking them, what do you say about the war? This is like a month into the war. They said everything goes according to plan. He says, according to plan, they were maybe reported 10,000 Gazans dead and a lot of ruins. They said, yes, this was part of the calculation. So not a wrong risk assessment. This was part of the calculation for what they wanted. They wanted to have a permanent status of war of Israel with all of its neighbors. And they said, look, now nobody, not just Israel, but nobody in the Middle East can sleep quietly. And about the Gazans, Khalil al-Khaya, the deputy of Sinwar, gave the most amazing answer, unbelievable answer. He says, we are Qassam, military brigade. We are jihad. We are not here to keep the health services or the electricity or the sewage for the Gazans. We are here to perform jihad. Now, if I was a Gazan, I would read that. I think I would be a little bit a bit angry. Like, he took the decision for the Gazans. They didn't vote for war or for, everything that they suffered because of the war.
Ronen, we're very focused on what Israel should learn from the lead up to October 7th. But if we turn to Hamas's perspective, given where the war is right now, from Sinwar's perspective, what conclusion, and I know this is, you're not in the head of Sinwar, but you are talking to a lot of people who study Sinwar and are trying to make sense of his decisions, his moves, and his thinking. What conclusion do your sources think Sinwar is drawing from how the war is going so far?
So, of course, this is a very long war. And if it continues, it's going to be the longest war in the history of Israel, approaching to longer of the War of Independence. And there were many developments. And so there's no one clear conclusion that he could have drawn. But starting from the end, and this is also supported by intelligence picked up by Israel, Sinwar feels that now he is in the best minute, in his best minute since the beginning of the war.
Right now.
Right now.
June of 2024.
Because Israel is under tremendous international pressure, because there is an internal dispute in Israel where the war is going, because the military supports shifting the attention to the north, because the prime minister is giving promises that he is not able to fulfill, and because of other reasons, and because Israel, for reasons I'm not going to get into now, because then we'll sit for another night, Israel relieved itself from most of the cards that it could use in exchange of the hostages. Meaning that Netanyahu refused to speak about the day after because of coalition considerations. And he wanted to satisfy the US government that became more and more concerned about the humanitarian issue with something. And instead of negotiating the humanitarian issue, which was the main card, and for reasons, again, complicated to explain now, but for some reasons very important to Sinwar, Israel just gave it away with no real sort of reward or no real exchange.
So Israel made major concessions on the humanitarian side and didn't get anything in return, except perhaps goodwill with the Biden administration.
No, of course. But if Netanyahu was negotiating the day after with Saudi, with Egypt, with the Palestinian Authority, maybe losing his coalition along that way, then there could be a settlement or there could be some kind of arrangement that would bring forces to the strip and making a third alternative. So it's not just Hamas or Israel, which is the alternative that any Gazans see now, but there will be a third one. And then Hamas would lose the one thing they're trying to keep, which is the Hamas rule of Gaza. And now Israel understands if it goes out, then the vacuum will be immediately fulfilled by Hamas because there's no one else. And Hamas is still in a much, much diminished way and bandwidth, but Hamas is still there. So from Sinwar's point of view, he was successful. Maybe he miscalculated on the dimension of the Israeli response. Maybe he thought it's going to be much limited. Maybe he thought that his success on October 7 would be much reduced. He was surprised from how successful they were. Now, for the last 6 months, we have been studying the videos that were created by the Nukhba in their phones and in their GoPros. Most of them never seen by anyone outside the Israeli intelligence community. And what you see a lot of things, but in the chatter among the Nukhba, they are surprised that they said, here we are for 2 hours, no airplane. There's no Israeli. You sort of accompany, you're embedded with their GoPro along the way, along Road 232, and there's no one. So they were surprised. In a way, they were over-successful because they got sort of stuck with too many hostages, and the Qataris were very, very mindful of the women and children, and were going tough on Hamas. So, and Sinwar was maybe surprised. But at the end, his plan for the tunnels succeeded. Redundancy, survival. The tunnels were developed for 3 reasons. One is the ability to maneuver forces from side to side underground. Second is to able to hit Israeli forces or Israeli civilians and, pop up and go underneath, maybe firing a rocket or firing an RPG. And the third, most important, is defense of the forces, with two assumptions. That if Israel invades, Hamas doesn't have the capability, not even close, to stop an Israeli tank maneuver. Like when you have an Israeli brigade of tanks going into and maneuvering, Hamas, maybe it can hit a tank or two, but it will not be able to stop them. What it can do is to gain time and hope that international pressure at a certain point would force Israel out. It's not easy for me as an Israeli to say, but if I were Sinwar, I see the materialization of this plan.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you about this question that I hear all the time from Israelis, which was, where was the IDF on October 7th? So we talked about the failures that led to October 7th. We talked about some of the missed signals or the failure to interpret signals, perhaps appropriately, right up to the night between October 6th and October 7th. But then there's the day of. The war starts. The invasion happens. It's not a raid. It's an invasion. It's a war. It's not 70 people at 2 points on the border, on the barrier and the fence. It's 70, as you said. It's war. Where's the IDF?
Few yards from where we are sitting here, the kitchen, in the living room.
In the kitchen, in the living room of Ronen's home.
Of Yana's and Ronen's home. And Zolfi's home.
And Zolfi, who you may have heard meowing. Yeah.
My colleague Adam Goldman and myself sat with a high-rank officer of the reserves, very, very trained and experienced and very critical with the military, who didn't think for one minute. And when he heard what is happening, he took his gun and went to the front. And of course, a gun was no good against what they had, but he took a rifle from, fortunately, a body of a dead policeman or a dead soldier. Then he fought, he killed 2 Nukhba on his way, and from that moment on, was in the front for many, many months. And he said to us, to Adam Goldman and himself, he said, if in a battle you have many heroes, that means that the battle went very bad. And in October 7, he says, there were many heroes. So maybe looking at this from sort of positive, I'll say that it could have been much worse. How can that be? It could have been much worse if it wasn't for those heroes, those brave officers or soldiers that just came and fought and arranged more than. But the IDF, the sad truth is that the IDF defense collapsed because Jericho wall plan was aimed at blinding and paralyzing the defenses throughout the border, and then raiding the different main base, the army base throughout the border. Now, the whole strategy of the south, of the Gaza border, was to have a military facility next to each of the kibbutzim and the communities. So if they are attacked, let's say that there's a raid, there's like a platoon of 70 Nukhba who are coming. So the immediate force that would be launched to help this kibbutz or the other would be from the military base. Mm-hmm. But once they were all attacked at the same time, and the military bases, they were fighting for their lives. They had nothing that they could do to help the kibbutzim, because nobody thought it's going to be across the border. Now, the defense strategy, or the defense plan, as much as there was one, was about defending from tunnels. It was the old one. Like, it called for stationing the forces, like, not across the wall, but much backwards. But the main thing was this: the attack and the paralyzation of the cameras and the sensors and some of the cell phone towers and the communication put the Gaza Brigade first.
The Gaza Brigade in the IDF.
The IDF, Gaza Brigade, is in charge of the defense, of the first line of defense on the Israeli side. And its headquarters in Re'im base was also attacked. And so they had not just the commanders that had or needed not just to run the whole defense, but also defend themselves. And for hours, it put the whole Israeli military into a total blindness, confusion, to the extent that one other high-rank officer who just, again, he lives in Tel Aviv, he took his gun, he took his rifle and went to fight. And he ended fighting in Sderot by the police station that was conquered by the Nukhba. And he said to himself, when we were done with the fighting over there, and there were no more policemen in siege there, and all the Nukhba terrorists were basically trapped inside the police station, he said, okay, I thought that we are the event. And once this is over, it's over. We didn't know that there are like 80 others. And each of those 80, the Israeli forces that fought there, as much as there were Israeli forces that fought there, thought that this is the story. And the Gaza brigade was not able to address. One of the commanders of the Israeli military said, let's assume that you have a hospital emergency room that is fully equipped with physicians, with blood, with medicine, with nurses for 10 people. It can function. And suddenly, you have 1,000. Now, of course, this will fail. So once the brigade was ready for a raid of maybe 2 places, even skeptical about that, and they have 60, they collapsed. But then what didn't happen was that other command groups of the IDF in the Southern Command in Beersheba or in the subterranean bunker in Tel Aviv, they also were not able to understand the situation and maneuver the forces for a very long time. Jericho Wall is a smart plan because they send forces, the Nukhba, to be on the main junctions. And so everyone trying to cross that junction. I know a guy who lives in Ma'ale Adumim, in West Bank. And they went, he's religious, they went to the synagogue. And suddenly they hear the sirens. And after a short while, they understand this is bad. He's a reservist in the counterterrorism unit. They went to the base. It's in Adam facility, not far away from Jerusalem. They took equipment. There were no cars. So they start in the Okan just driving. And while in the way, they were given to go to a specific kibbutz. But then he says, suddenly in Shara Negev Junction, I see someone standing with an RPG firing at us. And then I realized that at the beginning they thought maybe friendly fire, but then they realized that Hamas are in control of the junctions. And so everyone trying to get into Road 232, the main road of the border, close to the border, connecting all the different kibbutzim and communities, was under a direct threat of being killed. The forces that were on alert that night, as each night since 1974, a group of terrorists killed pupils
Ma'alot.
in Ma'alot.
Yeah.
So from that, the conclusion was that there needs to be few elite forces on alert every night, ready for something that was codenamed the Army of the Sky, Tzva Shamayim, which basically said there's a group of terrorists taking hostages, and the special force needs to come there as soon as possible, probably by helicopters, and get ready, first of all, like isolate the scene, and then maybe start negotiating. It was also a special negotiating team that was established afterwards. So when those special forces were rushing to help this kibbutz or the other, they thought that they need to get to the scene. They didn't understand that they're already in the scene. And many of them were killed in their car. And it took a lot of time. There will be more to come and published about what happened and why did forces that were on spot were waiting for an order to get in, and why they were even waiting, why they just didn't thrive for start fighting. This is about the military, the military itself. And there will be a hard and painful conclusions for the military until 20 minutes past 6 in the morning of that October 7th, that Sabbath, but also 6:20 onwards.
Ronen, we will leave it there. Thank you for hosting me here in your home, and I hope you'll come back because I feel like we only scratched the surface. And this was incredibly illuminating, but there's still a lot more to get to. So thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for coming. Jan and I are happy to have you all here. And I do hope that next time we meet, we'll have more optimist assessment towards the future.
I'll take that anytime. Anytime you got a dollop of optimism, you call me back. That's what we're here for. We need it.
Thanks.
That's our show for today. To keep up with Ronen Bergman, you can find him on X at Ronen Bergman, and you can also find his work at Yediot Achronot and at the New York Times. Call Me Back is produced and edited by Lon Benatar. Our media manager is Rebecca Strom. Additional editing by Martin Huergo. Until next time, I'm your host, Dan Sinwar.